Hello there. So in this video, I will, as promised, analyze how and why I goofed up last weekend and crashed my Cayman S at Sonoma Raceway. Let's get to it. So, watching the video of the lap and a half just before the crash, you can see that the conditions were clearly very slippery and wet. There were standing puddles of water, as you just saw, in a lot of places, and over those puddles, it was necessary to come off the throttle, not completely, but come off the throttle to make it through. And there, in fact, one of the largest puddles would just shift the car half a meter sideways if you went through it, even if you took it easy. And as you can see, I'm obviously struggling quite a bit with the car, but where I had plenty of oversteer is where I drove on, or where my driving line crossed the dry driving line. So in the wet, you obviously want to avoid the places where a lot of rubber has been laid down by other cars in the dry, because where it is where there's rubber, it is super slippery. The water is not able to soak into the ground, and the surface is super smooth. There's no roughness to bite into the tires. So I was doing my best, despite not being so familiar with the track, to avoid the dry lines. So such as here, had the track been dry, I've been much closer to the wall. So the line I was taking was to purposely avoid the dry line in the braking zone, and so that this way I would take a more V-shaped approach, and whereas the dry line would be kind of a U-shape, and so I'm trying to minimize the amount of time that I'm spending on the places where rubber has been laid down. So this is working relatively well in this corner. In the corners that are upcoming, because it's a relatively high-speed section, there's not that much rubber laid down by other cars in the dry. I think at least the few corners prior to these ones, the speed that you can go through them is more limited by the rate of acceleration that the vehicles are able to have, rather than the tire grip. Whereas obviously here with a huge puddle, that's not the case, but I was being very careful over here. So at this point, I was pushing pretty hard, trying to put together a good lap in the wet. You will see that on this fateful last lap, until the crash, I was actually doing pretty well, minimizing the amount of corrections I had to do. Especially in the next two corners, I think I did that pretty well. So by taking a slightly different approach, basically braking slightly earlier and being a bit more gentle on the throttle, I was able to go faster through these corners and have less of a moon. So especially this one, if you compare it to the lap previous to this, it was a lot less drama and a lot quicker, actually. Same here. I was able to exit this corner pretty cleanly with a minimal amount of countersteer. So unfortunately, this is where I crash. And if you listen carefully to the audio, you'll hear that my passenger says something to me. And funnily enough, the moment just before I crash, I say "huh," and just as I'm saying "huh," the rear steps out. I'm not fully focused, and I'm probably countersteering too late. And due to the loss of focus, I've come off the throttle. This leads to a violent tank slapper in the opposite direction, which was impossible to save. So I think what he says is 20 minutes, but at the time I couldn't hear what he was saying. So in my mind I was processing, okay, my passenger said something. I couldn't really figure out what it was. Okay, let me ask him what it is. So as my mind is preoccupied with this, maybe I was on the slightly wrong line. If you look at the video, you will see the revs of the engine go up slightly just before I start counter steering. So at that point, maybe I was on the slightly wrong line. Maybe the wheel hit, the tire hit a wet patch, which causes the rear to step out, and due to being unfocused at this point, loss of focus, I made this driving mistake, which results in me going off. Important to say, 100% my fault. Absolutely not my passenger's fault. It was a perfectly valid question from my passenger, and in fact, had I stopped earlier, my passenger wouldn't have asked me whether I should be stopping, and I wouldn't have had this crash. But if we're super technical about analyzing what exactly I was doing wrong as a driver, I was not fully focused, which led to the crash. So I think if you ever take any drifting lessons or high performance driving lessons, one of the first things you'll be taught is the fact that you need to be fully focused in terms of where your eyes are looking. You typically want to be looking maybe 3 to 5 seconds ahead of where you currently are at where you want to be going next. This way you feed your brain with information and don't get surprised. In this moment, my mind was surprised due to being preoccupied with other thoughts than driving, which was a fatal mistake. My mind was kind of like, oh crap, what happened? And so I think when my mind had this reaction, my foot came off the throttle, which was basically what sealed my fate, because coming off the throttle and then counter steering the vehicle does a violent tank slapper the other way. And at that point, it's basically impossible to save. So yeah, pretty painful to watch. I must admit. But if we look at this event at a high level, so obviously, had I had the wisdom to stop driving or to just go slow when it rains, I could have avoided it. But the problem is, I was having too much fun and I was not willing to back off. So, at a high level, I messed up. This is, but if we're getting more specific, I would point to the fact that this was my very first track day, very first time at this track, not being familiar with the dry and wet lines at this track. So if in the wet you're trying to avoid the places where a lot of rubber is put down, it helps a lot if you are very familiar with the track, which I wasn't. The car itself, the Cayman S, is a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car with an open differential. This is also making things a little bit tricky because the cars that I had previously, prior to the Cayman S, were front-engine rear-wheel drive with higher moments of inertia and maybe crucially locking differential. So the locking differential damps the vehicle in yaw, so that and also the moment of inertia of a front engine rear wheel drive car is typically higher than mid engine, and as a result, although the mid engine rear wheel drive car is more enjoyable to drive and more responsive, you need to be much, much more focused because the car is a bit less forgiving. Um, the thing which the low moment polar moment of inertia, which helps a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car rotate very quickly to your driving commands, also makes it easy to spin out if there's a certain disturbance at the front or rear. If there's a loss of grip at the rear. And yeah, so as already mentioned, the loss of focus at crucial moments, countersteer too late, countersteer too much, as a result of being too late, came off throttle, and then having a violent tank slapper. So this is my analysis. Might be that you have a slightly different take on it, and yeah, especially anyone that is familiar with Sonoma, please let me know what your thoughts are on my crash in the comments. Hopefully this video has been educational and helpful. Hopefully you learned something from it to avoid having a such unfortunate incident of your own. I must say I am super thankful of the fact that despite this crash, the consequences were relatively minor for both the car and myself and my passenger. That is absolutely the most important. I would have felt super guilty had anything happened to my passenger or myself. So, the car has been damaged, but it can be repaired, and the two of us are fine. That's absolutely the most important thing. Okay, so hopefully it was an interesting video. Until next time, let me know what you think in the comments.